And then he saw something impossible. Himself, standing beside them, fighting in a war that should have happened thousands of years ago. David's breath caught in his throat as the visions faded. No, that can't be real. Cale looked up at him, his small fingers clutching his shirt. You were there, David. You don't remember, but you were one of them. You were one of the protectors. David felt the weight of the truth slam into his soul. It explained everything. The strange instincts, the unnatural reflexes, the way he had always felt out of place on Earth. And now, it all made sense. He wasn't just protecting Cale. He had been protecting him for lifetimes. The enemy's last move. A sudden voice interrupted his thoughts. Touching. David turned sharply, aiming his stolen plasma rifle. Through the flames and smoke, General Vance emerged. His uniform was torn and bloodied, but he still carried himself like a man in control. Behind him, a squad of elite Earth soldiers marched forward, their weapons aimed at David and Cale. You don't even know what you're fighting for, Vance said, stepping closer. That thing, he pointed at Cale, is not a boy. He's the last piece of a war that should have ended long ago. The Vasheri are here to wipe him out for a reason. And if we don't stop him, everything we know ends. David's grip on the rifle tightened. You don't understand. He's not the threat. Vance shook his head. It doesn't matter. The higher-ups already decided. He nodded toward his men. Kill them both. The soldiers raised their weapons. David moved before they could fire. With lightning-fast reflexes, he grabbed Cale and dived behind cover, plasma bolts shredding the walls around him. Syra, who had been fighting off Vasheri warriors nearby, spotted the ambush. Without hesitation, she leaped into the fray, her energy blades flashing as she cut through Vance's men. David fired back, his shots landing with deadly accuracy. The soldiers fell one by one, but Vance himself kept moving forward, untouched, his own rifle trained on Cale. You can't stop this, Carter, Vance shouted over the chaos. Even if you escape, Earth won't hide him forever. David glanced down at Cale. The boy was shaking, his energy flaring wildly. He couldn't hold it back anymore. Cale turned his glowing eyes to David. I can stop this, he whispered. David's chest tightened. What do you mean? Cale took a step forward, his small hands lifted. And suddenly, the entire warship froze. Soldiers stopped mid-motion. Fires suspended in time. Even the Vasheri warriors, the ones who had feared him most, stood motionless, their weapons frozen mid-strike. Only David and Syra could still move. And in the middle of it all, Cale floated slightly above the ground, his golden energy spreading outward like ripples in a pond. His voice was calm. I understand now, he said softly. I know why I was created. David stared. Cale. The boy turned his gaze toward the sky, his eyes glowing brighter. The cycle of war must end. Then he raised his hands. The power of a starborn. A shockwave erupted from Cale's body, expanding outward like the birth of a new sun. The Vasheri ships froze in space, their engines failing. Vance and his men fell to their knees, gasping for breath. The entire warship groaned, as if reality itself was being rewritten. And then, Cale spoke a final command. Sleep. The battle stopped. The soldiers, the Vasheri, even Vance, all of them collapsed where they stood, unconscious. Only David and Syra remained standing. The ship creaked, its structure collapsing from the damage. David rushed forward, grabbing Cale as the boy's small body slumped against his chest. His glowing eyes dimmed, exhaustion overtaking him. David, Cale whispered, did I do the right thing? David swallowed the lump in his throat. He held the boy close. Yeah, kid, you did. The end of a war and the beginning of something more. With the ship falling apart, David and Syra raced to the escape pods. As they launched into space, David looked down at the warship, once a symbol of destruction, now silent and powerless. Earth had nearly made the biggest mistake in history, but Kale had given them a chance. A new beginning. As the pod drifted toward a distant star, David looked down at Kale, still unconscious but breathing peacefully. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And this time, he wouldn't fail him, no matter what came next. David reached the containment level just as alarms screamed through the ship. The Vasheri were boarding. The corridor leading to Kale's holding chamber was filled with soldiers, but not all of them were human. Tall, silver-skinned warriors in ornate black armor clashed with Earth's forces. Their weapons were sleek, elegant, and far deadlier than anything David had seen before. The Vasheri moved like ghosts, dodging bullets, slaughtering soldiers with precise energy blades. David didn't wait. He charged forward, taking down a guard with a quick shot to the leg. Another turned. David grabbed his rifle and slammed it into his face. The battle was chaos. Sparks flew. Explosions rocked the hallways. David finally reached the sealed chamber. Through the glass window, he saw Kale strapped to a containment chair, energy fields buzzing around him. The boy's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time, he looked afraid. David slammed his hand against the glass. "Kid, I'm getting you out of here." Before he could act, a Vasheri warrior appeared beside him. The alien tilted its head. "You would risk everything for this child." David didn't hesitate. "Yeah." The Vasheri studied him for a long moment. Then, to David's shock, the alien pressed a button on the control panel. The containment field deactivated. David blinked. "Wait. What?" The Vasheri stepped back. The prophecy must be fulfilled. The restraints on Kal's arms and legs snapped open. David rushed forward, grabbing him. "Come on, buddy. We're getting out of here." Kale, still weak, looked up at him. His voice was soft. "David, I remember now." David frowned. "What?" Kale touched his forehead. And suddenly, memories flooded into David's mind. Visions of an ancient war. A world burning. A promise made long ago. And in the center of it all, David himself. His breath caught. Kale whispered, "You were always meant to protect me." David staggered back, shocked. Before he could process anything, the ship exploded. The final stand. The warship shook violently, explosions ripping through the metallic halls as David Carter clutched Kale in his arms. Fire and debris rained down from the ruptured ceiling, sparks flying as the ship's power systems overloaded. The Vasheri fleet had arrived in full force. The enemy warships outside fired devastating energy blasts, tearing through the Earth's defenses, while inside, chaos reigned. Soldiers, both human and alien, were locked in battle, weapons clashing, energy bolts flying. And in the center of it all, standing in the flickering light of the collapsing chamber, was Kale. The boy, still weak from the containment, looked up at David. His golden eyes glowed faintly, as if something deep inside him was awakening. "I remember everything now," Kale whispered. David swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" Kale blinked slowly, and in an instant, David's mind filled with images. Visions of the past. A burning world. Towering golden beings standing before an ancient throne. A war fought in the void between stars, where entire civilizations were destroyed in the blink of an eye. And in the center of it all, Kal's people, the Starborn. David saw them. They were beings of immense power, not gods, but something close. Guardians of creation, keepers of the balance. They had once ruled not through conquest, but through wisdom. Until the Vasheri betrayed them. David saw their genocide, their worlds burning, their cities erased from history. His mind worked through the possibilities. How many guards? What security measures? There had to be a way out. Then, a sound. The cell doors slid open. General Vance walked in, his polished boots clicking against the floor. His expression was unreadable, but there was a sense of finality in his stance. "David," he said calmly, "I hoped you'd come to your senses by now." David's jaw tightened. "Where's Cal?" Vance sighed. "He's safe. We're studying him. You should be thanking me." David laughed bitterly. "Yeah? For what? Kidnapping a child? Torturing him like some experiment?" Vance didn't flinch. "He's not a child. He's the last of a species that shouldn't exist." David's fists clenched. "And that justifies this." Vance stared at him for a long moment. Then he said something that sent a chill down David's spine. "The Vasheri want him." David's breathing slowed. "What?" Vance's expression darkened. "The alien empire that wiped out Cal's people, they know he survived. They've sent a war fleet." David's heart pounded. This was bigger than he thought. Vance leaned forward. "You need to understand something. Cal isn't just some lost child. He is the key to something ancient, something that should have died with his people." David swallowed hard. "What is he?" Vance exhaled slowly. "You've seen it, haven't you? The energy inside him. That wasn't just power. It was a remnant of the Starborn prophecy." David frowned. "Starborn?" Vance nodded. "A legend, a warning, passed down by dying civilizations. The Starborn were said to be gods of creation and destruction. They had power beyond imagination, power to reshape reality itself. Cal is the last of their kind. And if he falls into the wrong hands, the galaxy burns." David's breath hitched. Cal, a quiet, innocent boy, a weapon of unimaginable power. Vance studied his face. "Now do you see why we can't let him go?" David shook his head. "No. What I see is a scared little kid being treated like a threat instead of a person. You think locking him up will make this better?" Vance's expression hardened. "You don't get it, Carter. We're not the only ones coming for him. The Vasheri will destroy Earth if we don't hand him over." David froze. Vance stepped back. "You have one chance. Help us contain him, or let the galaxy decide his fate." David gritted his teeth. "You already know my answer." Vance sighed. "Then I'm sorry, Carter." He turned to leave. But before the door closed, he muttered one last thing. "We're transferring him to the warship's core containment unit. If you try anything, we'll make sure you never see him again." And then he was gone. The door sealed shut. David exhaled slowly. His mind raced. They were moving Cal. That meant there was still time. He just had to break out of a maximum security warship first. The escape plan. David studied the cuffs around his wrists. The metal was infused with energy dampeners, making it impossible to break through brute force. He needed a distraction. Luckily, one arrived sooner than expected. A sudden, violent tremor shook the ship. The lights flickered. David's cell door unlocked. He blinked. "Well, that's convenient." Then the intercom blared. "Warning. VHARA forces have BREACHED the perimeter. All units report to combat stations." David's pulse quickened. The Vasheri were here. He ripped off the cuffs and bolted down the hallway. Soldiers rushed past him toward the ship's hangar, completely ignoring the escaped prisoner in their panic. David didn't waste time. He grabbed a fallen guard's sidearm and moved. He had one objective: find Cal. The battle for Cal. The grenade detonated, sending fire and smoke everywhere. Zira grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the transit shaft. They ran, leaping over debris as the tunnel collapsed behind them. At the end of the tunnel was a rusted old elevator platform, a remnant of an old underground railway system. "This should take us up," Jaira said, slamming the controls. The platform shook before jolting upward, racing toward the surface. David let out a shaky breath, still holding Cal close. But as the smoke cleared, he saw Vance standing below, watching them leave. The general's face was calm. Too calm. And then David saw the small device in his hand. A beacon. Realization hit him too late. A deep rumbling shook the ground. David's heart sank. Vance had called in reinforcements. And not just soldiers. A massive warship appeared in the night sky above the city, its black silhouette blotting out the stars. The air vibrated with the sound of its engines. And then, hundreds of drop pods began descending toward them. Captured. The elevator platform reached the surface, but they weren't alone. Soldiers were already waiting, their weapons raised. David barely had time to react before something slammed into the side of his head. The world spun. He hit the ground hard, his vision blurring. Through the haze, he saw Cale being ripped from his arms. The boy let out a weak cry, reaching for him. Then, darkness. David woke up to the cold. His wrists were bound in metal restraints, his body strapped to a chair in the center of a dimly lit prison cell. His head pounded, and his ribs ached from the earlier fight. "Ah, you're awake." David recognized the voice immediately. General Vance stepped into the light, his hands clasped behind his back. His uniform was clean, his expression unreadable. David's jaw tightened. "Where's Cale?" Vance sighed. "Safe, for now." David struggled against the restraints. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Vance raised an eyebrow. "Don't I?" He turned, pressing a button on a nearby console. A holographic screen flickered to life, showing a secured research lab. In the center of the lab, strapped to a metal table, was Cale. David's stomach twisted. The boy's small body was surrounded by machines, strange energy readings fluctuating wildly on the monitors. Scientists in white coats worked around him, their faces filled with fear and awe. "He's not human," Vance said simply. "Not entirely. He's something else, something that shouldn't exist. Do you have any idea what will happen if the rest of the galaxy learns about him?" David didn't answer. Vance stepped closer. "Tell me, Carter, if he wasn't just a child, if he was really something dangerous, would you still protect him?" David's heart pounded. He didn't hesitate. "Yes." Vance studied him for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room. The door slammed shut, locking David inside. He let out a slow breath, forcing himself to think. He needed a way out, and he needed to get to Cale before it was too late. The truth about the prophecy. David Carter sat in the cold, dimly lit cell, his wrists bound in heavy metal restraints. The walls were smooth steel, humming with a faint energy field, an anti-escape measure. He had been in prisons before, war camps, hostile territories, but never had he felt so helpless. Cale was in danger, and he had failed to protect him. David clenched his fists. No, he wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. One of them stepped back, its red eyes flickering. "Impossible," it muttered. Cale turned his head, his small hands clenched into fists. A pulse of golden energy rippled outward from his tiny frame. Every hunter in the tunnel screamed, a horrible mechanical sound, as their armor began to crack and shatter. David shielded his eyes from the light. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the energy vanished. Silence. David slowly uncovered his face. The hunters were gone, or rather, what was left of them. Their armor was shattered, their bodies broken beyond recognition. They hadn't just been defeated. They had been erased. Cale blinked, his golden eyes dimming. Then his small body collapsed into David's arms. David caught him, his mind racing. What the hell just happened? Zedera knelt beside them, her expression unreadable. He awakened. David shook his head. "What does that mean?" Before Exira could answer, the gunfire started. Not from the hunters. From behind them. David turned sharply, just in time to see figures in human combat armor flooding the tunnel entrance. Earth's military. And at the front of them, standing tall, was someone David recognized. General Marcus Vance. David's former commander. The betrayal. Vance stepped forward, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. His gaze landed on Cale, then on the shattered remains of the hunters. His face remained stone cold. "David Carter," he said, voice clipped and official. "Step away from the child." David's stomach sank. "What?" Vance's soldiers raised their weapons. "You heard me," Vance said. "Hand over the boy. Now." David didn't move. He tightened his grip on Cale's unconscious body. His mind raced. Vance had known. He had always known. Zaira stepped between them, her energy blade still glowing. "You're making a mistake, human." Vance barely looked at her. The only mistake was letting this go on for so long. "The boy is a threat. You don't understand what he is." David's pulse pounded in his ears. "Then explain it to me." Vance shook his head. "I don't have to. Orders are orders." David realized then, this wasn't a negotiation. His own people were against him. "David," Vance said, his voice colder now. "Don't make me do this. Step aside." David looked down at Cale. The boy was small, fragile, completely unaware of what was happening. Then he looked back up, at the guns pointed at him. For the first time since this started, David realized, the real enemy wasn't just the hunters. It was his own kind. And he had just been betrayed. Zaira gritted her teeth. "David, we need to move." David exhaled slowly. Then he did the only thing that made sense. He ran. Gunfire erupted behind them. Zaira threw a grenade, filling the tunnel with smoke. David clutched Cale tightly and sprinted deeper into the underground, with Zaira covering their escape. This fight wasn't over. Not even close. Infiltrating the warship. David ran. His breath came in sharp, quick gasps as he clutched Cale tightly against his chest. Zaira sprinted beside him, her energy blade still glowing as she covered their retreat. Behind them, gunfire erupted in the underground tunnels. The military forces, led by General Vance, were in pursuit, their boots pounding against the metal floor. David gritted his teeth. His own people were trying to kill him. "We need an exit," he shouted over the noise. Zaira's sharp eyes scanned the tunnel ahead. "There's an old transit shaft up ahead. If we can reach it." A sudden explosion cut her off. The shockwave threw David off his feet, sending him and Cale tumbling across the hard ground. His back slammed into the tunnel wall, pain shooting through his ribs. Cale let out a weak groan, still unconscious. David coughed, trying to push himself up, but a shadow loomed over him. General Vance. The man stood with his rifle aimed directly at David's head. "Game over, Carter," Vance said coldly. His soldiers surrounded them, their weapons raised. "Hand over the child. Now." David's grip on Cale tightened. "He's just a kid." "He's not just anything," Vance snapped. "You saw what he did back there. He's a weapon that shouldn't exist." David's chest heaved with rage. "So you'd rather kill him?" Vance's expression remained unreadable. "If necessary." David felt something snap inside him. He had seen war. He had lost friends. He had followed orders, even when they felt wrong. But this was murder. And he wasn't going to let it happen. Without thinking, he lunged forward. Vance pulled the trigger. But before the shot could land, Zaira moved faster than human eyes could track. Her glowing blade slashed through the air, severing the rifle in half before Vance could react. Sparks flew, and the general stumbled back in shock. David didn't hesitate. He grabbed a discarded grenade from a fallen soldier's belt, activated it, and tossed it into the group. "Time to go," he shouted. "The hunt begins." Before they could process what had happened, a distant alarm echoed through the underground tunnels. David turned toward the sound. "Tell me that's not what I think it is." Zaira cursed. "They've tracked us. The hunters are coming." David clenched his fists. He looked down at Cale, still unconscious. He looked at Zaira, who was clearly hiding more than she was saying. Then he looked toward the darkness of the tunnel, where their enemies were closing in fast. David exhaled slowly. He had been a soldier once, a survivor, a man who always fought for himself. But now he had a reason to fight. He stood up, rolling his shoulders. Then let's stop running. Zaira blinked. What? David picked up the alien weapon she had given him earlier. He checked the charge. Fully loaded. He turned to Zaira. I'm tired of running. You want me to protect the kid? Fine. Then let's fight. Zaira grinned. Now you're starting to sound like yourself. David had no idea what she meant, but it didn't matter. Because when the hunters arrived, he would be ready. The betrayal. The underground tunnel hummed with a strange, unnatural silence. The distant alarm still echoed through the passage, growing louder by the second. David Carter tightened his grip on the alien weapon, his pulse steady now. No more running. This time, they were going to fight. Zaira stood beside him, her breathing still heavy from her wounds, but her posture was strong. Cale, still unconscious, lay cradled in David's arms. The energy that had burst from him moments ago was gone, but David could still feel something strange in the air, like the static before a thunderstorm. Then, from the far end of the tunnel, a deep metallic voice rumbled through the dark. We know you are here. The words weren't shouted. They weren't even loud. And yet, they echoed through David's bones like a command from something ancient and unstoppable. Then footsteps. David exhaled slowly. How many are we dealing with? Zaira didn't take her eyes off the dark tunnel ahead. Too many. Great. David's grip on his weapon tightened. The footsteps grew closer. Shadows moved. The first hunter stepped into the dim light. It was massive, nearly 8 feet tall, its dark armor shifting like liquid. Its glowing red eyes locked onto David first, then flicked to Cale. Target acquired. It rumbled. David didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. A blue beam of plasma shot from the weapon, slamming into the hunter's chest. Sparks flew, and a creature stumbled back, but it didn't fall. David cursed. Okay, they're tougher than they look. That was a warning shot, Zaira muttered. Before David could ask what she meant, she lunged forward. Her twin energy blades ignited, glowing with bright violet light. She moved like lightning, dodging an incoming strike from the hunter's massive claws and slicing upward. The hunter roared in pain as one of its arms fell to the ground. David blinked. All right, that's cool. More hunters rushed into the tunnel. Zaira barely had time to recover before 2 more leaped toward her. David fired again, aiming for the joints between their armor. This time, he got lucky. One collapsed, sparks flying from the wound. The second one charged him. David barely had time to react before the hunter's massive arm slammed into his chest, sending him flying backward. He hit the ground hard, the alien weapon skidding away. Cale tumbled from his arms, rolling across the dirt. David. Zaira's voice cut through the chaos. David gritted his teeth and pushed himself up, ignoring the pain in his ribs. He lunged toward Cale, grabbing him before the hunters could. The child stirred, his eyes fluttering open. And then, something changed. Cale's eyes weren't their normal dark color anymore. They glowed golden. The air around him shimmered, and the entire tunnel shook as if reality itself was reacting to his awakening. The hunters froze. The secret of the child. The warehouse trembled as a deep rumbling echoed outside. David gripped the alien weapon tightly, his heart pounding. Zaira stood beside him, her breath uneven from her injuries. Blue blood still seeped through the cracks in her armor, but she didn't seem to care. Her glowing eyes were locked on the large metal doors of the warehouse. Cale clutched David's arm, his small hands trembling. Boom! The entire wall shook violently as something massive slammed into it from the outside. David swallowed hard. Any chance we can talk our way out of this? Zaira smirked despite the pain. With them, She shook her head. They don't talk. They take. Another thunderous crash, and this time, the metal door buckled inward. A deep mechanical voice echoed through the air. Give us the child, or burn. David had heard threats before, but this time, something inside him rebelled against the idea of surrender. He took a deep breath. Not happening. Cale gripped his sleeve tighter. Zyra nodded approvingly. Good choice. Before David could react, she raised her hand, pressing a button on her gauntlet. A massive explosion erupted from the ceiling, sending metal debris crashing down on top of the invading forces outside. The shockwave rattled David's bones. Time to go. Zyra shouted, grabbing Cale and pulling him toward a hidden tunnel in the back of the warehouse. David didn't argue. He followed, heart racing. Into the underground. The tunnel was dark, damp, and cold. It led downward, deeper than David expected, through a series of winding paths under the city. The air smelled like dust and old metal. The walls were lined with ancient-looking machinery, some of it still humming with power. Cale kept close to David, his small hand still gripping his sleeve. After a few minutes, David spoke. All right. No more running. I need answers. Now. Zyra stopped. She turned to face him, her face serious. You want the truth? She asked. David folded his arms. I think I deserve it. Zyra sighed. She glanced at Cale, then back at David. Fine. She took a deep breath. Then she said words that made David's entire world shift. Cale is not just a child. He is the last of an ancient race. David frowned. What does that mean? Zyra's expression softened slightly as she knelt beside Cale, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Long ago, before humans even knew about life beyond their world, there was a war between the strongest races in the galaxy. The ones who started it were called the Vasheri. They were powerful, ruthless, but they were losing. David listened carefully. His instincts told him this was important. The enemy they were fighting were Cal's people, a race so old, so advanced, that they didn't even have a name anymore. They were legends. David glanced at the boy. He still looked human, but deep down, he knew Cal wasn't. So what happened? He asked. Zyra's gaze darkened. The Vasheri feared them, so they wiped them out. Every last one. Genocide. A chill ran down David's spine. And Cal. Zyra's grip on the boy's shoulder tightened. He was the only survivor. David's stomach twisted. But that doesn't explain. Why are they after him? Why are they calling him an asset? Zyra hesitated. Then she said something that shattered David's understanding of reality. Because Cale isn't just a survivor. He is the key to something greater, something powerful. The last of his kind, yes, but also the last of a secret that should have died with them. David's throat went dry. What secret? Zyra looked at Cale, then back at David. The power to reshape the galaxy. The awakening. Before David could respond, Cale let out a sharp gasp and clutched his head. His small body shook violently. Cal. David crouched down. Hey, kid, what's wrong? But Cale wasn't listening. His eyes turned completely white, and a strange golden glow flickered around his small frame. Zyra grabbed David's arm. Get back. The air around Cale shimmered like heat waves. His body trembled as a voice, a deep, ancient whisper, echoed from somewhere unseen. The cycle continues. The war is not over. The child of the Starborn must awaken. David felt the hairs on his arms rise. Cal's small hands clenched into fists. The glowing energy around him exploded outward, sending a powerful wave through the tunnel. The machinery in the walls short-circuited instantly. Metal bent, sparks flew. David was blown backward, slamming into the ground. Zyra shielded her face from the blast, but even she looked shocked. Cale collapsed, unconscious. The glow around him faded. David pushed himself up, breathing hard. What the hell was that? Sarah stared at Cal, her face unreadable. The beginning, she whispered. The beginning of everything. Escape and unanswered questions. David Carter ran faster than he ever had in his life. The weight of the small boy in his arms was nothing compared to the pounding fear in his chest. Behind him, the city erupted into chaos. The alien warrior, who had claimed this child was his, stood alone against the monstrous hunters, fighting with inhuman speed. Energy swords clashed, sending out blinding flashes of light. The police, outmatched, scrambled for cover as bullets bounced off the hunter's armor. Civilians screamed and ran in all directions. David forced himself to look away. He had to keep moving. "Hold on, kid," he muttered under his breath as he darted through the narrow alleyways of the city. The child clung to him, his small fingers digging into David's shirt. A deep mechanical roar sounded behind them. David risked a glance over his shoulder. A hunter had broken away from the fight and was coming after them. The creature was faster than any human, moving in unnatural bursts of speed. Its glowing red eyes locked onto David like a predator tracking prey. David's heart pounded. He spotted a delivery truck parked near the alleyway. Without thinking, he sprinted toward it, threw open the driver's door, and climbed in. The keys were still in the ignition. For once, luck was on his side. He slammed his foot on the gas. The truck roared to life, tires screeching against the pavement. Just as the hunter leaped toward them, David yanked the steering wheel hard, slamming the side of the truck into the creature. The impact sent the hunter crashing into a nearby building. David didn't stop to see if it would get up. He sped down the streets, weaving between abandoned cars. The boy in the passenger seat stayed silent, his wide eyes fixed on David. For the first time, David really looked at him. The child had dark, slightly curled hair, pale skin, and a face that looked completely human. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old, but there was something in his eyes. Something ancient. David swallowed hard. Who are you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The boy hesitated. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "My name is Cal." David's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. That name meant nothing to him. So why did it feel so familiar? Before he could ask more, a new voice spoke. "Turn left. Now." David nearly jumped. He grabbed the small earpiece that had suddenly appeared in his ear. Where had that come from? "Who the hell is this?" David barked. "It's me," the voice said. "Syra, I'm still alive, but not for long. I need you to get to the safe house." David clenched his jaw. Syra, the alien warrior, the one who had thrown this entire nightmare into his life. And now she was giving him orders. "Listen, lady," he snapped. "I don't know who you think I am, but this isn't my fight. I don't know this kid, I don't know you. And I sure as hell don't know why a bunch of alien assassins are after me." There was a pause. Then, Syra's voice came back, calmer but urgent. "David, I know you don't remember, but you were chosen for this a long time ago." The word sent a strange shiver down his spine. The boy, Cal, was staring at him. His small hands clutched the seatbelt. His eyes were filled with something David didn't understand. Was it trust? David gritted his teeth. He had two options. Throw the kid out and leave him to the aliens. Keep driving and find out the truth. He sighed heavily. There was really only one choice. "Fine," he muttered. "Tell me where to go." The safe house. 30 minutes later, David pulled into a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The area was abandoned, just old factories and broken streetlights. He killed the engine and stepped out, keeping Cal close. A hidden door in the warehouse wall slid open. A wounded Syra stumbled out, clutching her side. Her armor was cracked, and dark blue blood dripped from her wounds. "You look like hell," David said. Syra grunted. "You should see the other guy." She stepped toward Cale and gently placed a hand on his head. The boy leaned into her touch like he had known her his whole life. David crossed his arms. "Now start talking." Tira took a slow breath. "Cale is no ordinary child." "He is." Before she could finish, a deep rumbling shook the ground. David's eyes widened. Something massive was approaching. Zira cursed under her breath. "They found us." Cale grabbed David's hand. "Please," he whispered, "don't let them take me." David looked down at the small, terrified boy. Something inside him snapped into place. It didn't matter if he didn't understand. It didn't matter if this wasn't his fight. He wasn't going to let them take this kid. Zira threw him a weapon, a strange alien pistol that hummed in his grip. "Hope you still remember how to fight," she said. David gritted his teeth and aimed the gun. The battle was about to begin. The arrival of the stranger. David Carter was just another man in the city. He had a simple life, a quiet job as a researcher and a small apartment with no family to call his own. His past as a soldier was far behind him. But everything changed on a day that started like any other. It was a bright afternoon when the sky above the city ripped open with a loud crack. People on the streets looked up, confused and afraid. A massive spaceship appeared out of nowhere, hovering above the tallest buildings. It was nothing like the ships humans had seen before. Its metal surface shifted like liquid, and strange symbols glowed along its edges. Before anyone could react, a bright beam of light shot down from the ship. A figure appeared in the middle of the street, surrounded by thick smoke. People screamed and ran in every direction. Cars stopped. Sirens blared. David, who had been drinking coffee at a small cafe, froze. His instincts from his time in the military kicked in. He watched closely as the smoke cleared. Standing there, holding a small child in her arms, was a towering alien warrior. She was unlike anything David had ever seen. She wore dark, battle-scarred armor, and her long silver hair flowed behind her like a cape. Her skin was a shade of deep blue, and glowing tattoos ran across her arms. But it was her eyes that caught David's attention. They were sharp, focused, filled with a mix of pain and purpose. The alien warrior looked straight at him. She stepped forward and spoke in perfect English, her voice echoing through the silent street. "This is your son." David's breath caught in his throat. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his coffee. "What?" His voice was barely a whisper. The alien woman took another step forward, holding the child out toward him. The boy looked around with wide, curious eyes. He was human, or at least he looked human. His dark hair was messy, and his small hands clutched the warrior's armor tightly. David shook his head, taking a step back. "I don't have a son." The warrior's expression didn't change. "You do now." People around them whispered and pointed. Some took out their phones, recording everything. The police sirens grew louder. Soldiers in black uniforms arrived, aiming weapons at the alien. "Put the child down." A voice shouted over a loudspeaker. "Get on your knees." The alien didn't move. She just looked at David, her glowing eyes narrowing. "They are coming." Her voice was low, urgent. "You must take him. You must run." David felt his heart pounding. None of this made sense. Why would an alien warrior bring a child to him? And why did she look so sure, so desperate? Before he could ask, a new sound filled the sky. A deep humming noise vibrated through the air. The spaceship above them shifted, and from its dark surface, strange black pods shot down, slamming into the streets around them. The ground shook as the pods cracked open. Then they stepped out. Tall, armored figures with glowing red eyes and long, sharp weapons. The hunters. They moved with unnatural speed, scanning the area. One of them raised a clawed hand and pointed directly at the child. "There," a deep mechanical voice said. "Seize the asset." The alien warrior drew her weapon, a sleek, curved blade that hummed with energy. "David Carter," she said firmly, "if you want to live, take the boy and follow me." David hesitated for only a second. Then something inside him snapped. He didn't know why, but every instinct screamed that this child was important. Gunfire erupted. The police opened fire, but their bullets bounced off the hunter's armor like harmless dust. The creatures lunged forward, moving faster than human eyes could follow. The warrior grabbed David's arm and shoved the child into his chest. "Run," she commanded. David held the boy tightly. The child clung to him, his small hands trembling. For the first time in years, David Carter ran for his life. Cliffhanger. As David sprinted through the streets, carrying the boy, he looked back and saw the warrior standing alone, her blade glowing. The hunters surrounded her. Before they reached her, she turned to David and shouted her final words. "Protect him. No matter what happens, do not let them take him." Then the hunters attacked.